The journey we are about to take in this episode of the Natives Journals will delve into one of the most somber chapters in history. A chapter where the clash of colonial ambitions and cultural dominance led to the suffering of countless Native American children. The boarding schools that we'll explore weren't just institutions of education. They were tools of cultural suppression, designed to extinguish the very essence of indigenous identity. Inside their oppressive walls, generations of Native American children faced a systematic effort to erase their languages, customs, and even their names. Forced from their homes, these young souls were thrust into environments where their heritage was seen as a barrier to progress and was violently stripped away. Today, the echoes of these injustices reverberate through Native communities, where the scars of this cultural genocide are still healing. So before we dive into this heart-wrenching story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support enables us to continue sharing these vital stories, ensuring that these voices, long silenced, are finally heard. Your engagement with us truly makes a difference. The history of Native American cultural erasure is profound and deeply tragic. It begins with the arrival of European settlers on the shores of North America. From the moment the settlers set foot on this continent, Native Americans were faced with the loss not just of their lands, but of their way of life. Colonization was not only about territorial conquest, it was a full-scale assault on indigenous existence. Centuries-old traditions, languages, and spiritual practices, which had been passed down through generations, were suddenly under threat. The settlers sought not only to claim physical territory, but to impose their worldview on the native peoples. With each wave of colonization, Native Americans found themselves pushed further from their ancestral lands and deeper into cultural alienation. This forced assimilation was not immediate, but over time, it manifested in increasingly aggressive policies that aimed to erase the Native identity. One of the darkest manifestations of these policies came in the form of the Indian boarding schools. During the late 19th century, a troubling chapter unfolded. Under the guise of education and progress, a sinister system was born, one that would forever alter the lives of Native American families. Beginning in the 1870s, the U.S. government enacted policies that led to the creation of federal Indian boarding schools. These institutions, scattered across the country, were designed to civilize Native children, forcing them to abandon their cultural roots in favor of European American values and language. But what seemed on the surface to be an attempt to provide education was, in fact, a calculated effort to dismantle Native American culture from within. Children were forcibly removed from their homes, taken from the warmth and safety of their families, and thrust into a world of unfamiliarity and often cruelty. In these schools, they were forbidden to speak their native languages, to practice their traditional customs, or to express their cultural identities. If they disobeyed, they were often met with harsh punishment, beatings, isolation, and emotional abuse. These boarding schools were, in essence, factories of assimilation. The underlying philosophy was summed up in the infamous words of Captain Richard Henry Pratt, founder of one such institution, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. This chilling sentiment encapsulated the entire mission of the boarding school system. It was not merely an attempt to integrate Native Americans into American society, but a direct attack on the very core of their identities. The trauma inflicted by these boarding schools did not end when the children left. It rippled through generations, leaving a legacy of pain, disconnection, and cultural loss. Native children who survived these institutions often found themselves unable to fully reconnect with their families or their heritage. Many had forgotten their languages, their spiritual practices, and their sense of belonging to a community. This loss of cultural continuity has had profound and lasting effects on Native American communities, contributing to cycles of poverty, disenfranchisement, and social challenges that continue to this day. The boarding schools, which operated well into the 20th century, left deep psychological wounds on countless individuals and families. Entire generations grew up with fragmented identities, feeling torn between the dominant society they were forced to adapt to and the indigenous roots they were taught to be ashamed of. For many, The schools represented a profound loss of self, a disconnection from their history, their ancestors, and their place within their communities. But the story of Native American boarding schools is not just one of tragedy. It is also a story of resilience. Despite the systematic efforts to destroy their culture, Native Americans endured. They fought to preserve their traditions, even when doing so meant risking punishment. Some children, even in the face of brutal discipline, would whisper their languages to one another in secret. Others clung to their traditions in the quiet corners of their minds, waiting for the day they could return home. In the latter half of the 20th century, the truth about the horrors of the boarding school system began to come to light. Native American activists and communities started to speak out, sharing the stories of those who had suffered in silence for so long. The federal government, under increasing pressure, began to acknowledge the wrongs that had been committed. In recent years, there have been efforts to heal the wounds left by this dark period in American history, with some former boarding schools being transformed into cultural centers or museums dedicated to the preservation of Native American heritage. Yet, even as we look back at this tragic history, we must also look forward. The legacy of cultural erasure has had long-term effects on Native American communities, but there is hope in the resilience of these communities to reclaim their languages, traditions, and identities. Through programs focused on cultural revitalization, language preservation, and education, many Native American tribes are actively working to heal from the generational trauma inflicted by the boarding school system. In the end, the story of Native American boarding schools is a reminder of the strength of indigenous cultures in the face of overwhelming adversity. Despite the relentless efforts to erase their identities, Native Americans continue to thrive, holding fast to the belief that their heritage is not something to be forgotten, but something to be celebrated and passed down to future generations. So, as we conclude this episode of the Natives Journals, we remember those who endured the unimaginable. Their stories of survival, pain, and resilience echo through the corridors of history, a testament to the enduring power of cultural identity. Please consider subscribing to our channel to continue exploring these stories of Native American history. By understanding the past, we help shape a future where these narratives are honored and where the strength of Native American communities continues to shine through. The mission of boarding schools was clear: to civilize Native American children by stripping them of their culture, language, and identity, which were regarded by the colonizers as savage. These institutions aimed to assimilate indigenous youth into Euro-American ways of life, often with brutal and dehumanizing tactics. Children were forcibly removed from their homes, taken from their families, communities, and everything they knew. It was not just their physical presence that was taken. Their identities were attacked and erased in an effort to mold them into something they were not. In these schools, Native American children were compelled to adopt Christianity and renounce their own spiritual traditions. Forced conversions were only one part of the calculated effort to eradicate Native cultures. The suppression of indigenous languages was another. In many boarding schools, speaking one's native tongue was strictly forbidden, often under threat of corporal punishment. Languages that had been passed down through generations, each word carrying centuries of cultural significance, were deemed inferior and outlawed. Teachers and administrators often beat children if they spoke in their native language, ensuring that the sounds of their ancestors were silenced. Not only were languages targeted, but sacred traditions and practices that were central to Native identity were also systematically erased. Ceremonies, rituals, and spiritual practices were deemed heathen and banned within the confines of these schools. It was a heartbreaking process, one that sought to erase the spirit of indigenous youth and mold them into a homogeneous, Eurocentric society. Even small details of personal identity, such as hair, were forcibly altered. Many Native American cultures consider long hair to be a symbol of pride and cultural identity. Yet children in boarding schools were forced to cut it short, another symbolic gesture of erasing their heritage. At the center of this campaign was Captain Richard Henry Pratt, a Civil War veteran, whose infamous quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man," encapsulated the philosophy of the boarding schools. Pratt believed that the path to civilizing Native Americans was through education, or more accurately, indoctrination. He envisioned a system where indigenous children would be transformed into productive members of American society, but only by erasing every trace of their native identities. Pratt founded the first Indian boarding school in the United States, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. This school became the model for others across the country. Before Carlisle, Pratt had already begun experimenting with his methods by educating 72 native prisoners of war in St. Augustine, Florida. These prisoners, who had fought against the U.S. Army, were subjected to his rigorous methods of forced assimilation. He taught them English, imposed Christian beliefs, and trained them in various manual trades. The first students recruited to Carlisle were 86 Lakota Sioux children taken far from their families and tribes. They were taught in English, given Euro-American names, and indoctrinated into Christianity. Pratt's program quickly became the blueprint for a nationwide system. Soon, the U.S. government began opening boarding schools across the country, all based on the work he had pioneered. Many of these children were forcibly removed from their homes by armed police, a violent and traumatic experience that only compounded their emotional suffering. In some cases, Native parents were left with no choice but to send their children to these schools because public schools were closed to Native Americans. Federal boarding schools, in such cases, became the only available option for education, though they were anything but beneficial to the children who attended. The strategy of the boarding schools was cruelly effective. In many cases, Native children were sent far away from their reservations, often to locations where they could not easily return home. This isolation was intentional, as school authorities believed that keeping children away from the corrupting influence of their families and tribes was essential to achieving the goal of assimilation. John B. Riley, an Indian school superintendent, wrote in a report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1886, "Only by complete isolation of the Indian child from his savage antecedents can he be satisfactorily educated." These words echo the mindset that fueled the boarding school system, a belief that indigenous culture was something to be erased rather than embraced or preserved. By the early 20th century, the United States had established 367 boarding schools for Native American children. Over half of these schools were operated by the federal government, while approximately 100 were run by the Catholic Church, and various Protestant denominations managed many others. In states like Wisconsin, the government ran 3 boarding schools directly, while also overseeing 3-day schools and contracting 3 more boarding schools to religious and other organizations. The impact on Native American families was devastating. Most of the children who attended these schools did not go willingly. They were forcefully taken from their homes, in some cases never to return. Families were torn apart, and children, separated from their cultural roots, were left to navigate a world that viewed their very identity as a problem to be fixed. The tragedy of the boarding school era continues to reverberate through Native American communities today. Generations of indigenous people grew up disconnected from their languages, traditions, and families, leading to cycles of trauma, loss of cultural knowledge, and deep psychological scars. The systematic efforts to erase Native American identity did not just hurt individuals. It weakened entire communities, undermining the cultural foundation that had sustained them for centuries. Yet despite this horrific chapter in history, many Native American communities have fought back against the erasure of their cultures. In recent years, efforts to revitalize indigenous languages and traditions have gained momentum, with many tribes working to reclaim their cultural heritage and heal the wounds left by the boarding school system. In the end, the boarding schools may have aimed to destroy Native American identity, but they did not succeed. Today, the resilience and strength of Native American cultures continue to shine through, a testament to the enduring power of cultural survival in the face of overwhelming adversity. The curriculum in Indian boarding schools was not designed to educate or nurture Native American children, but rather to indoctrinate them with the dominant Euro-American worldview. Subjects like reading, writing, math, and history were taught exclusively from a white perspective, often distorting or erasing the true history and culture of Native peoples. Boys were trained to farm, while girls were taught domestic tasks like sewing and cleaning, roles that aligned with Euro-American societal expectations. The children were also forced to cut their hair, an act particularly traumatic for many indigenous people, as hair held cultural and spiritual significance. Additionally, they were made to wear uniforms, speak only English, and abandon their native languages. These schools had a dual focus: religious conversion to Christianity and the teaching of U.S. citizenship. The goal was to mold indigenous children into compliant members of American society by erasing their native identities. However, the methods used to achieve this were often brutal. The discipline in Indian boarding schools was notoriously harsh. Children endured beatings, isolation, and other forms of punishment for the slightest infractions, such as speaking their native languages or failing to perform their tasks as instructed. The conditions inside these schools were deplorable. They were chronically underfunded, overcrowded, and unsanitary, creating an environment ripe for disease. Malnourishment was rampant, and many children suffered from hunger. These schools, whether run by the federal government or religious organizations, became breeding grounds for illnesses such as tuberculosis, measles, and trachoma. Outbreaks were frequent, and the schools had cemeteries on site due to the high number of deaths. Tragically, thousands of children died from preventable diseases while attending these schools. Students were also subjected to various forms of abuse. Physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual mistreatment were common in both government and church-operated boarding schools. The trauma inflicted on the children was profound, leaving scars that would affect them for the rest of their lives. In many cases, students were forced to perform manual labor in addition to their academic tasks. Rather than being allowed to return home during the summer, many were sent on summer outings to work for white families as farm hands or domestic servants, often for little or no pay. These outings were not opportunities for rest or connection with their families, but instead extended the period of exploitation and control. The appalling conditions at the schools contributed to the rapid spread of infectious diseases. Dormitories were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and often lacked proper sanitation. Diseases such as tuberculosis, the flu, and smallpox spread quickly in these environments, claiming the lives of many children. One of the most heartbreaking accounts came from Luther Standing Bear, a student at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. He recalled that nearly half of his fellow Lakota classmates died during their time at the school. At some institutions, students were expected to construct coffins for their classmates who had passed away in school woodshops, a chilling and tragic reminder of the death that surrounded them.